Okay, we are looking today at chapter 4 in the book In His Steps. And before we get started, I wanted to read a bit of scripture that goes along with it. It's Luke 14:25 through 33. And it's entitled, The Cost of Being a Disciple. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. And anyone who does not carry his cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Will he not first sit down and estimate the cost to see if he has enough money to complete it? For if he lays the foundation and is not able to complete it, everyone who sees it will ridicule him, saying, this fellow began to build and was not able to finish. Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Will he not first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and ask for terms of peace. In the same way, any of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple." So chapter 4 tells us during the week, Mr. Norman, that would be Edward Norman, the editor of the paper, received numerous letters commenting on the absence from the news of the account of the prize fight. If you will remember, the people of First Church some of them decided that they would, for a whole year, devote their lives to asking a question before they made any decisions in their lives. And that question is, what would Jesus do? So last week we read how the first of the business people actually put that into practice. He went into his newspaper on Monday morning and he decided, I don't think Jesus would put the account of a championship boxing match in the paper and have it fill up 3.5 columns. I don't think that would be a Christian thing to put in the paper, and he left it out. And there's backlash, which we will see more about now. So it says that he received numerous letters commenting on the absence from the news of the account of the prize fight. 2 or 3 of these letters may be of interest. Editor of the News, dear sir, I've been thinking for some time of changing my paper. I want a journal that is up to the times, progressive and enterprising, supplying the public demand at all points. The recent freak situation of your paper refusing to print the account of the famous contest at the resort has made me decide finally to change my paper. Please discontinue it. Very truly yours. And then it was signed. And it was the name of a businessman who had been a subscriber for many years. This one says, Edward Norman, editor of the Daily News, Raymond. Dear editor, what is this sensation you have given the people of your town? What new policy have you taken up? Hope you don't intend to try the reform business movement through the avenue of the press. It's dangerous to experiment much along that line. Take my advice and stick to the enterprising modern methods you have made so successful for the news. The public wants prize fights and such. Give it what it wants and let someone else engage in the reforming business. Again, signed by the writer of the letter. And then it says, Here's another one. It says, "My dear Mr. Norman, I hasten to write you a note of appreciation for the evident carrying out of your promise. It is a splendid beginning, and no one feels the value of it more than I do. I know something of what it will cost you, but not all the details. Your pastor, Henry Maxwell." One other letter, which he opened immediately after reading this from Maxwell, revealed to him something of the loss to his business that possibly awaited him. "Mr. Edward Norman, editor of the Daily News. Dear Sir, at the expiration of my advertising limit, you will do me the favor not to continue it as you have done heretofore. I enclose a check for payment in full and shall consider my account with your paper closed after this date. Very truly yours." And after that, followed by one of the largest dealers of tobacco in that city. He'd been in the habit of inserting a column of conspicuous advertising and paying for it at a very large price. Remember now, this book was written back in the 1800s, late in the 1800s, and tobacco was very prevalent in the country. Norman laid this letter down thoughtfully, and after a moment, he took up a copy of his paper and looked through the advertising columns. There was no connection implied in the tobacco merchant's letter between the omission of the prize fight and the withdrawal of the advertisement, but he couldn't avoid putting the two together. In point of fact, he afterward learned that the tobacco dealer withdrew his advertisement because he had heard that the editor of the news was about to enter upon some strange reform policy that would be certain to reduce its subscription rate list. But the letter directed Norman's attention to the advertising phase of his paper. He had not considered this before. As he glanced over the columns, he couldn't escape the conviction that his master could not permit some of them in his paper. Remember, what would Jesus do in this circumstance? Would he allow these different businesses room to advertise in a paper going out to all these households? What would he do with that long other advertisement of choice liquors and cigars? As a member of a church and a respected citizen, he had incurred no special censure because of the liquor and tobacco companies that he'd been advertising. No one thought anything about it. It was all legitimate business after all. Why not? Raymond enjoyed a system of high license, and the bars and the billiard halls and the beer gardens were just a part of the city's Christian civilization. He was simply doing what every other businessman in Raymond did. And it was one of the very best paying sources of revenue. What would the paper do if he cut these out? Nobody told me I didn't have my microphone on, so sorry. Anyway, like I said, it was one of the very best paying sources of revenue. So what would the paper do if he cut out these ads? Could it survive? That was the question. But was that the question after all? What would Jesus do? That was the question he was answering, or was trying to answer this week. Would Jesus advertise whiskey and tobacco in his paper? Edward Norman asked it honestly, and after a prayer for help and wisdom, he asked Clark, his assistant, to come into the office. Clark came in feeling that the paper was at a crisis and prepared for almost anything after his Monday morning experience. This was only Thursday. "Clark," said Norman, speaking slowly and carefully, "I've been looking at our advertising columns and have decided to dispense with some of the content just as soon as the contracts run out. I wish you would notify the advertising agent not to solicit or renew the ads that I have marked here." and he handed the paper with the marked places over to Clark, who took it and looked over the columns with a very serious expression. This is going to mean a great loss to the news. How long do you think you can keep up this sort of thing? Clark was astonished at the editor's action and he really couldn't understand it. So the editor says, Clark, do you think if Jesus were the editor and proprietor of a daily paper in Raymond that he would permit advertisements of whiskey and tobacco in it? Well, the man answered, well, no, I don't suppose he would. But what is that to do with us? We can't do as he would. Newspapers can't be run on any such basis. Why not? Asked Norman quietly. Why not? Because they'll lose more money than they make, that's all. Clark spoke out with an irritation that he really felt. We shall certainly bankrupt the paper with this sort of business policy. Do you think so? Norman asked the question not as if he expected an answer, but simply as if he were talking with himself. After a pause, he said, You may direct Marks to do as I've said. I believe it is what Christ would do. And as I told you, Clark, that is what I have promised to try to do for a whole year, regardless of what the results may be to me personally. I cannot believe that by any kind of reasoning we could reach a conclusion that would please our Lord in the advertisement in this age of whiskey and tobacco in a newspaper. There are some other advertisements of a doubtful character I shall look into too. Meanwhile, in regard to these contracts, I feel a conviction that cannot be silenced. Clark went back to his desk, feeling as if he had been in the presence of a very peculiar person. He couldn't grasp the meaning of it all. He felt enraged and alarmed. He was sure any such policy would ruin the paper as soon as it became generally known that the editor was trying to do everything by such an absurd moral standard. What would become of business if this standard was adopted? It would upset every normal custom and introduce endless confusion. It was simply foolishness. No, it was downright idiocy. So Clark said to himself, and when Marks was informed of the action, he seconded the managing editor with some very forcible ejaculations. What was the matter with the chief? Was he insane? Was he going to bankrupt the whole business? But Edward Norman had not yet faced his most serious problem. When he came down to the office Friday morning, he was confronted with the usual program for the Sunday morning edition. The News was one of the few evening papers in Raymond to issue a Sunday edition, and it had always been remarkably successful financially. There was an average of 1 page of literary and religious items to 30 to 40 pages of sports, theater, gossip, fashion, society news, and political material. This made a very interesting magazine of all sorts of reading matter and had always been welcomed by all the subscribers, church members and all, as a Sunday morning necessity. Edward Norman now faced this fact and put to himself the question, what would Jesus do? If he were editor of a paper, would he deliberately plan to put into the homes of all the church people and the Christians of Raymond such a collection of reading matter on the one day of the week which ought to be given up to something better and holier? He was, of course, familiar with the regular arguments of the Sunday paper that the public needed something of the sort, and the working man especially, who would not go to church anyway, ought to have something entertaining and instructive on Sundays, his only day of rest. But suppose the Sunday morning paper didn't pay. Suppose there was no money in it. How eager would the editor or publisher be then to supply this crying need of the poor workman? Edward Norman deliberated honestly with himself over the subject. Taking everything into account, would Jesus probably edit a Sunday morning paper, no matter whether it brought a profit? That was not the question. As a matter of fact, the Sunday News paid so well that it would be a direct loss of thousands of dollars to discontinue it. Besides, the regular subscribers had paid for a 7-day paper. Had he any right now to give them less than they supposed they'd paid for? He was honestly perplexed by the question. So much was involved in the discontinuance of the Sunday edition that for the first time he almost decided to refuse to be guided by the standard of Jesus's probable action. He was the sole proprietor of the paper after all, and it was his to shape as he chose. He had no board of directors to choose or to consult as to the policy. But as he sat there, surrounded by the usual quantity of material for that Sunday edition, he reached some definite conclusions. And among them was a determination to call in the force of the paper and frankly state his motive and purpose. He sent word for Clark and the other men in the office, including the few reporters who were in the building, and the foreman, and what men were in the composing room. It was early morning and they were not all in, to come into the mailing room. This was a large room, and the men came in curiously and perched on the tables and counters. It was a very unusual proceeding, but they all agreed that the paper was being run on new principles anyhow, and they all listened to Mr. Norman as carefully as he spoke. I called you in here to let you know my further plans for the news. I propose certain changes which I believe are necessary. I understand very well that some of the things I've already done are regarded by you workers as strange. I wish to state my motive in doing what I've done so you'll understand it. And so he told the men what he had already told Clark, and as they stared at him as Clark had done and looked about as painfully bothered as he had. Now, in acting on this standard of conduct, I have reached a conclusion which will, no doubt, cause some surprise to all of you. I've decided that the Sunday morning edition of the News shall be discontinued after next Sunday's edition. I shall state in that issue my reasons for the discontinuing. In order to make up to the subscribers the amount of reading material that they may suppose themselves entitled to, we can issue a double number on Saturday, as is done by many of the evening papers that make no attempt at issuing a Sunday edition. I'm convinced that from a Christian point of view, more harm than good has been done by our Sunday morning paper. I just don't believe that Jesus would be responsible for it if he were in my place today. It will occasion some trouble to arrange the details caused by this change and to be fair with all the advertisers and to the subscribers. That's for me to look after. The change itself is one that I am determined will take place. And as far as I can see, the loss will fall on myself. Neither the reporters nor the pressmen need to make any particular changes in their plans. He looked all around the room and no one spoke. He was struck for the first time in his life with the fact that in all the years of his newspapers, he had never had the entire force of the paper together in this way. Would Jesus do that? That is, would he probably run a newspaper on some loving family plan where editors, reporters, pressmen, and everybody would meet to discuss and devise and plan for the making of a paper that they should have in view? He caught himself drawing almost away from the facts of the typographical unions and office rules and reporters' enterprise and all the cold business-like methods that make a great daily successful. But still, that vague picture came up in the mailing room, would not go away. When he had gone into his office and the men had gone back to their places with wonder in their looks and questions of all sorts on their tongues as they talked over the editor's remarkable actions. Clark came in and had a long, serious talk with his chief. He was thoroughly roused, and his protest almost reached the point of resigning his position. Norman guarded himself carefully. Every minute of the interview was painful to him, but he felt more than ever the necessity of doing the Christ-like thing. Clark was a very valuable man to him. It would be difficult to fill his place. But he wasn't able to give any reasons for continuing the Sunday paper that answered the question, what would Jesus do, by letting Jesus print that edition? So it comes to this then, said Clark frankly, you will bankrupt the paper in 30 days. We might as well face that future fact. I don't think we shall. Will you stay by the news until it's bankrupt? Asked Norman with a strange smile. Mr. Norman, I don't understand you. You are not the same man this week that I knew before. I don't know myself either, Clark. Something remarkable has caught me up and borne me on. But I am never more convinced of future success and influence for the paper. And you haven't answered my question. Will you stay with me? And that is the end of chapter 4. We will have to wait until next week, Kathy, to see if he stays or not. By the way, the first man died. You heard, okay. Okay, so got some questions for you to think about today. As I said earlier, we are looking at the cost of following Jesus, and it could be a pretty high cost. That's what Edward Norman is finding out. Today's chapter was all about the changes that had been made at the newspaper and making that newspaper, changing it into a business that would be more in line with one that put Jesus first. So how many of you people here today run a newspaper? Nobody, right? I didn't think so. But how would your lives be affected if you were to adopt that same outlook, the same way of running your life that some of the members of the first church took on? What if you lived your lives by asking, what would Jesus do as you went through your daily life? Most of you here, James, maybe Erica, would be the exception. The rest of us don't go to work every day. So changing our business lives really wouldn't be the issue that Edward Norman was facing. But what do you do during the day? Many of us, myself included, spend at least a small part of our days watching TV, don't we? It may just be catching the news in the evening or something like that, but usually sometime during the day, we turn the TV on. So let's begin with that today. What if What if Jesus came to your house today and sat down with you and wanted to spend time with you watching TV? What would change? It's exactly right. For a lot of us, it could be the channel. Why? Yeah. Would you still watch the same shows that you're watching when he's not there? How uncomfortable would you be to have him sit with you through some of those episodes that maybe use some questionable language, which is becoming more and more prevalent, isn't it? And some of the shows are now depicting some what we call alternative lifestyles. And they portray it, all of it, the language and the lifestyle, is a very normal way of life. This is the way everybody lives today. Nobody should think anything different, right? What would Jesus do in a situation like that? If you decided maybe, after thinking about this, like Edward Norman took a look at his paper, so if you got to looking at what's being shown and heard from your television set, what might you do to change what they do? Could you spearhead a drive to change it? Could you or would you get in touch with the people making those shows possible through the advertising and let them know that Christians aren't comfortable watching the shows that they're broadcasting, or the content, at least, of some of the content? Were you? Good for you. Good for you. I mean, how many of us want our children, our grandchildren, to grow up listening to the language that they use, watching the lifestyle that's being portrayed as normal on some of these shows as normal, or violence? Yes. Now, Mimi and I laugh about our murder mysteries, but to our credit, we usually come into these shows after the violence has been done, and we just see who done it. So, you know, we don't need to go through all the gory details of seeing the person get that way. So we'll try to do our shows a little bit better. But what should be done? Should we allow this box in our house to rule over us and tell us how we should live our lives? Or should we be telling that box and the shows that are being broadcast from it that their way is not the right way? Some of us can go back to when one word was first used on television as a cuss word, and everybody was just, they said damn on television. And it was a shock, wasn't it? Bill and Francis can remember that, I'm sure, and Joan. And, you know, people got over the shock after a while, and then they said it again, and it wasn't quite as shocking. Until now, that's about the mildest thing that you could say on television. Because they just keep us getting used to these things. If we don't allow it to happen, then we won't get used to it. It is not the normal way for us to live our lives, is it? We need to be thinking, what can we do? Can we contact the broadcasting networks? Can we contact the advertisers? Money talks. If we quit buying certain products because they promote certain things in life, that gets their attention. So think about that. What could you do? What would Jesus do in your life, in your situation? There's a cost to following Jesus. But if we all band together, we can make a difference. Let's bow our heads together. Lord God, we're so thankful that we do have a voice still in what is broadcast in our homes and what is what kind of programs. We're so thankful for the networks the Christian networks that broadcast the wonderful stories that we don't have to be ashamed of watching, and that we would welcome Jesus to come into our homes and watch with us. But help us as we make our daily decisions to ask ourselves, what would Jesus do? And then go away living our lives based on the answers that we get. Amen.